We're ready, great. Well, good evening and welcome to the 11th talk of the 223rd year of the Royal Philosophical Society's series of lectures. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah, okay. If at any point the sound feels bad at the back, please let us know. Some housekeeping first. There are no planned fire drills. So the fire exits are through these doors out the front. The toilets are downstairs. There's a disabled toilet on this floor as well. Please turn off your mobile phones, pagers, or silence them for the duration of the talk. In the Q&A session, the microphone will be passed around. Please hold it like this. This one isn't on just now, so it's not functioning as you would expect, but please hold it like this. It's quite directional, but it works very well. And of course, after the Q&A session, as usual, there will be a chance to chat with folk over a drink in the foyer. The next and last talk of this session will be on the 19th of March, when Dame Muffy Calder will talk on a day in the life of a computational scientist. The talk will be preceded by the Society's annual general meeting. So, tonight's speaker. I'm delighted to welcome Lindsay Paterson, Professor Emeritus, Edinburgh, to talk to us tonight. He was telling me he was born in Glasgow. But this is not really his hometown in any real way, but he feels a great affection and sympathy for Glasgow in many ways. A good affection and sympathy in the old-fashioned way. He's a fellow of the British Academy and of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and held a Leverhulme grant from 2018 to 2021. For several decades, he has been researching, studying, and advising on educational policy and their impact on Scottish society, with particular reference to the second half of the 20th century. He is no stranger to public debate on these matters. His talk tonight is titled, "What Happened to the Democratic Intellect? The Neglect of Knowledge in the Scottish Educational Policy."
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Yes, I do feel vicariously that this city is my home. My parents come from here, and many of their ancestors came from here as well. So there's always a sense, not only in coming to this city, but coming to this particular institution here on the hill, that this is the kind of education which Scotland aspired to, and I'll explain that shortly. The distinguished psychologist Daniel Willingham of the University of Virginia has summed up the importance of knowledge in education like this. Although the ultimate purpose is to learn how to think, he said, knowledge comes into play mainly because if we want our students to think critically, they must have something to think about. Now, you might suppose that this combination of knowledge and thinking would fit naturally into the Scottish educational tradition according to the way in which it is usually described. Scotland's leading historian of education, Robert Anderson, summed up that tradition as it operated in the universities of the 19th century as a willingness to make connections between diverse subjects, an interest in general theories, and a tendency to make use of systematic classifications and abstract categories, a tendency that lasted until at least the middle of the 20th century. That broad Scottish tradition has famously been described by the philosopher George Davy as the democratic intellect. The Scottish universities, he said, in teaching mathematics and science, language and literature, gave an unusually large amount of attention to the first principles and metaphysical ground of the disciplines. Yet that firm foundation in disciplinary knowledge is not how the Scottish school curriculum has been in recent decades. A distinction between knowledge and skills has come to lie at the heart of curricular policy. Skills are asserted as being fundamental, both for the individual learner and for the flourishing of society. Knowledge is never actually defined or discussed in current curricular documents, remaining only as a slogan, part of a litany that has vocational skills as the only outcome. For example, in a recent policy document talking about the knowledge, skills and attributes to thrive in a modern society and economy. Now, all this may be thought to be a matter of arcane academic debate about the definition of skill and knowledge, except that there is now abundant evidence that the quality of Scottish school education is not what we might want it to be. The best evidence of the recent decline comes from the 3-yearly Programme for International Student Assessment, or PISA, which is run by the OECD. It tests students at age around 15 in reading, mathematics and science. In reading, Scottish attainment has been flat since 2006 after a steep fall from the beginning of the century. In mathematics, Scotland declined steadily from 2006 to 2018 and then fell sharply to 2022 after COVID. In science, there has been a steady decline in Scotland since 2006, gentle at first and then steep, and with no evidence, in fact, that COVID affected the rate of decline. Attainment has fallen at all levels, in the highest attaining 10%, the average, and the lowest 10%. Moreover, although social inequality of attainment in these PISA studies was falling before the disruption caused by COVID, that was only because the attainment of the most socially advantaged students was falling. The attainment of disadvantaged students was not rising, but was stable or simply falling less than the advantaged students. And that kind of equality of immiseration is not what the Scottish tradition aspired to. What makes this Scottish decline even more striking is that England has been going in the opposite direction. Attainment there has been rising in the PISA studies. Until COVID, inequality in England was falling because the poorest have been improving more rapidly than the richest, but all social groups have been improving there. And because the English curriculum since the turn of the century has been increasingly focused on knowledge, this contrast of experience between Scotland and England has intensified the debate about the contrast of curricular philosophies. The importance of knowledge has also been clarified by the experience of other school systems around the world. Estonia, Ireland and Singapore have improved with curricula based on disciplinary knowledge. Finland, France, Korea and New Zealand have declined as their curricula have moved away from a firm basis in knowledge. And England has not been alone in halting decline by redefining the school curriculum on the basis of knowledge. There are similar experiences in Poland, Germany, Japan and Massachusetts. The suspicion then arises that the current problems with Scottish schools might have something to do with the current neglect of knowledge and thus with the neglect of the Scottish intellectual tradition. My purpose this evening is ultimately to comment on what is wrong with the present, but I'll get there by asking, why does Scotland have the reputation of a great educational past? I'll then consider why the recent change of curricular philosophy came about, and I'll examine in more detail how that change has altered what we expect children to learn. And then I'll finish by summing up why this matters for the future of Scottish education and for the character of Scottish society and democracy. The belief that Scottish education was excellent by international standards at one time rested on the simple facts that rates of participation were higher. At a time before schooling was extended to everyone, that numerical superiority was enough to make plausible the claim of national educational distinction. The numerical superiority related to both primary schooling and universities. The primary school foundations derive ultimately from the Reformation ideal of creating a school in every parish, so that everyone, male and female, rich and poor, could read the Bible, and so that there would be an educated male laity which could play a part in the governance of the church. This parish system did take a long time to be achieved, but it was eventually consolidated by an act of the Old Scottish Parliament in 1696. The system had become almost fully national by the beginning of the 19th century, the main gap being in the Gaelic-speaking areas which were not fully integrated into the national system until the end of the century. The Catholic Church built up its own system of primary schools in the late 19th century, which became part of the national system after 1918. So as a result of all this, over Scotland as a whole, literacy levels among people aged in their 20s and 30s in the late 19th century were high, at over 90%, much the same as in Sweden and England, and far ahead of Southern and Eastern Europe. The same numerical distinction of participation was true of the universities. Part of the Scottish tradition was a belief that universities should be socially open. Now, in one fundamental respect, this was wholly untrue, insofar as women were barred from graduating until 1892. The conventional description of the tradition tends to ignore sex, focusing instead on social class. But when women did achieve access, their numbers rose rapidly. The historian Robert Anderson concludes from his careful analysis of the 19th century evidence that what he calls the Scottish democratic myth had some substance, and that members of the British elite recruited there in the 19th century may have had broad social origins than their English counterparts. In the 1860s, the Scottish universities had a social reach that was high also by wider European standards. Now, these traditions of relatively high participation in both elementary and higher education were real, but Scottish distinctiveness of participation rates diminished in the 20th century as other countries caught up. And so the historically high Scottish rates of participation haven't been directly relevant to Scottish distinctiveness since about the middle of the 20th century. Scotland had a primary enrolment rate in 1950 that was almost identical to the 90% found in the world's richest countries. The same was true of literacy rates. By the middle of the 20th century, most European countries had literacy rates of 80% or greater, and so Scotland did not stand out so starkly. As with the primary schools, the distinctiveness of higher education also diminished when other countries expanded their universities. By the 1950s, about 12% of young people entered higher education in Scotland. That was much the same as in England and in the Scandinavian countries, and was no longer strikingly greater than elsewhere in Europe. And, of course, by the early 21st century, all Western European countries had rates of participation around 50%, still very similar to Scotland's. It may be, of course, that the Scottish reputation has continued to rest on these now very out-of-date rates of relatively high participation. But there was much more to the reputation because it rested also on what was taught. In this connection, we can indeed start again with the universities because their numerical importance allowed their influence to permeate the whole system. First of all, the parish schools in the 19th century, and then more profoundly, the new secondary schools of the 20th century. In fact, most of the debate about the democratic intellect, as applied to the universities, relates to the curriculum rather than to the social basis of their students. I've already quoted a historian and a philosopher on this. Here's a contemporary impression from John Stuart Mill when he was elected as rector of St Andrews University in 1867. This comes from his rectorial address. To comment upon the course of education in the Scottish universities, he said, is to pass in review every essential department of general culture. These disciplines were united in the Scottish universities, he said, by a belief that they each conduce to the improvement of the individual mind and the benefit of humanity. They all conspire to the common end, the strengthening, exalting, purifying, and beautifying of our common nature. In particular, he included science in this. He said, unless an elementary knowledge of scientific truths is diffused among the people, they never know what is certain and what is not, or who are entitled to speak with authority and who are not, and they either have no faith at all in the testimony of science, or are the ready dupes of charlatans and impostors. At the heart of this curriculum was philosophy, the discipline that would allow the disparate understandings of all the other disciplines to be unified. George Davy, the philosopher, describes the Scottish understanding of philosophy as being like a sixth sense, coordinating all the others and creating shared understanding. As he put it, common sense in its meaning is knowledge which results from the pooling of information received through one's different senses, also means common sense, achievable through mutual communication with someone else. These university ideas then deeply shaped the curriculum of secondary schooling as it emerged for the first time in the early years of the 20th century in Scotland. That university shaping of secondary schooling continued to be powerful until the 1980s. For good or ill, the university influence created a secondary school system that was based on the principle that the only advanced education worth having was the systematic acquisition of academic knowledge. It is that academic aspiration of secondary schooling which gives us, I think, the best clue as to where the reputation of Scottish education has stemmed from until the recent decline. The system of secondary schools in Scotland that we know today was established in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Their curriculum was determined by the Scottish Leaving Certificate that was founded in 1888. It was the predecessor of all subsequent school examinations at various times highers, national, standard grades, O grades, and lowers. The curricular principles governing the Leaver Certificate were essentially a shift to the schools of the old principles of liberal education that had emerged in the universities. The key elements here were first that the subject we call English assumed something of the place that moral philosophy had in the old undergraduate programme. English in Scottish schools always included the study of literature, as a way of discussing ethics, a philosophical tendency that was strengthened by the inclusion of what we now call history and geography in the English syllabuses. The aim of English may be summed up by a comment in 1910 from A.M. Williams, who was the head of the Glasgow Centre for Training Teachers, the predecessor of Jordan Hill College. He said, "The place of literature and moral education was to make people after Milton's ideal, fitted to perform justly, skillfully, and magnanimously all the offices, both private and public, of peace and war." As well as English with geography and history at the core of the secondary curriculum, there was breadth in a modernised form. Latin was gradually replaced by modern languages, especially French. Mathematics and science were treated as modes of thinking as well as conferring practical skills. For example, in 1919, J. Arthur Thompson, who was Professor of Natural History in Aberdeen and who helped to develop the science syllabus for schools, argued that students should seek after science primarily in the hope of clearer vision, not because of expected miracles of loaves and fishes. Entrance to the 5-year school courses, the senior secondary courses that could lead to these examinations, was regulated by entrance tests that were taken at the end of primary school, informally known as the qualifying exam, or colloquially as the quali. Among those who qualified were approximately equal numbers of male and female students for the first time. There was an unprecedentedly large minority from working class families because the number of free secondary schools had risen 5-fold by the early 1920s. And the incorporation of the Catholic schools into the public system at that time also then started to give equal opportunities to the children of Catholic families. Before the 1950s, these Leaving Certificate courses were still taken only by a minority. In the 1930s, only about a third of pupils entered the courses that led to the Leaving Certificate, and at most about 5% successfully passed all the assessments that qualified them for the full certificate. A further third of pupils didn't get beyond basic literacy and numeracy. Nevertheless, the middle third did have a curriculum that had something of the knowledge-based principles that the Leaving Certificate derived from the universities. This too, along with the Leaving Certificate courses, contributed to shaping Scotland's educational reputation in the second half of the 20th century. The intermediate aspect of post-primary provision grew up at the same time as the Leaving Certificate was being developed in the 1890s and first decade of the 20th century. The subjects taught were a mixture of the core liberal curriculum and a few vocational topics, the most commonly taken being English literature, physical geography, Latin, French, animal physiology, mathematics, magnetism, electricity, and domestic economy. By 1903, these intermediate departments were operating in nearly 400 schools, attached to nearly half of the primary schools across the country. This is a time when there was about 200 full secondary schools. And so the sheer numerical extent of primary schooling became a means by which this ultimately university-derived curriculum could be disseminated widely. A flavour of the standards of what was taught in these intermediate level courses may be had from the annual reports of the school inspectors. For example, in 1905, the Chief Regional Inspector for West Central Scotland described a typical pupil in a typical school in Glasgow. The school is typical, he said, because it is an ordinary elementary school attended by the children of ordinary working class parents. And the scholar is typical because she is simply a good specimen of a good class under a good teacher. In these 7 months, he said, this 13-year-old girl read, and the teacher revised with the whole class, The Merchant of Venice, A Christmas Carol, the novels The Talisman and the Abbot by Scott, Enoch Arden by Tennyson, and Evangeline by Longfellow. 13-year-old working class. From the same year, the inspector's report in Edinburgh said that the details of verse structure and the nature of use of figurative language are widely known, and an appreciation of the more elusive aspects of poetry is often apparent. In Perth, the inspectors commented that the very successful observational work had been done in connection with the rocks and plant life of the district. It's on the basis of such lessons that the Professor of Education at Edinburgh University, Simon Laurie, could ask in 1890, following his external inspection of the schools of North East Scotland, is there any visitor of schools in the world who is able to say that he has examined in Virgil and Greek pupils on the pauper roll? Now, this aspiration to an academic curriculum for pupils who had not qualified for the courses leading to the Leaving Certificate persisted into the years between the wars and into the 1950s. So for about half of the pupils who had not been selected for the Leaving Certificate courses, the core was as academic in aspiration as the courses leading to that certificate: English, history, geography, science, and mathematics. The reputation of Scottish education in the 20th century was mainly based on this expanded secondary schooling, shaped by the liberal academic curriculum that ultimately was owing to the universities. But that link to the universities also ensured that it was a highly selective system. The reputation of Scottish schooling was high because the highest status products of it had been selected in a highly competitive way. Their success was visible because they went on to populate the new professions of the welfare state. They became the doctors, lawyers, scientists, engineers, business leaders, civil servants, politicians, and teachers. The most successful products of the intermediate courses attended apprenticeships to become skilled tradesmen or attended the new training colleges after the war to become secretarial staff. Unprecedented proportions of all these groups were female, Catholic, and from working class origins because of the extensive new provision of secondary schools. But their high achievements and their diverse origins obscured the failures of those who did not make it. And this was evident in two ways in the 1950s and after. One was that despite the extension of secondary schooling, those who were successful in it were disproportionately from middle-class families still. In 1962, for example, about 10% of all students passed the 3 or more hires that at that time were the entrance qualification for the universities. But the proportion qualifying from professional families was 1/3, whereas from working class families it was only 7%. The difference was almost entirely because working class children were less likely to pass the qualifying test for entry to the full secondary courses. The other confirmation of the relative weakness of what was offered to students who were not academically able is from international comparative studies that were pioneered in 1964, 1970, and 1980, the predecessors of today's PISA studies. In each, the highest attaining 10% or highest attaining 30% of students aged 13 in Scotland were doing better than any of the West European countries that took part in these surveys, consistently better than France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Sweden, and West Germany. They were also better than Finland, equal to England, and not far behind Japan and Hungary. The best 10% were the students likely to qualify for university a few years later. But the average Scottish student was then no better than the West European average and was far behind Japan, Israel, and Hungary. It was the achievements of the high achievers which sustained the reputation of Scottish education for excellence, even while the average Scottish student was, unlike in the 19th century, no longer ahead of their counterparts elsewhere. So the question in the 1960s and the 1970s was how to widen access to the demanding curriculum of the full secondary courses. The main policy change was the ending of selection into different kinds of secondary school, which took place throughout Britain, but which incurred much less acrimony in Scotland than in parts of England. The comprehensive schools initially continued the principle of breadth, rigour, and through literary studies for reflection on human existence that previously had been a characteristic of the academic courses. The principle of this was summed up by Professor Guy Neave, then of London University, later of the University of Twente, writing in 1976. In most Western countries, the distinction, he said, between academic and non-academic courses is regarded as one of the major historical obstacles to a democratic system of education. In Scotland, the reverse is true. The concept of a curriculum dominated by a highly academic content has been justified in the name of creating a common course for all. The most important element of continuity with the selective senior secondary courses into the comprehensive era was that there was no fundamental change to the standards of the hires. There was also, for the first time, formally recognised academic courses for the intermediate level, building on the previous academic aims for that level that I have described. First of all, ordinary grades from 1962, and then by the late 1980s, new standard grade courses. The standard grades entrenched even more strongly the old Scottish idea of liberal education based on academic subjects. The official committee that led to these courses, reporting in 1977, argued that socially relevant issues cannot really be explored without making use of the insights provided by the various traditions of intellectual inquiry, and that there are many activities and experiences which do not seem to have any direct bearing on the social realities of pupils' lives, but which nonetheless have a profoundly liberating effect. Then gradually, throughout the 1980s to the end of the century, access to this kind of academic curriculum based on traditions of academic thought was gradually widened. For example, the proportion of school leavers who passed English at the mid-secondary level doubled from 38% in the mid-1970s to 73% at the end of the century. And by pass, I mean an award at A to C in O grade or 1 to 3 in standard grade. The proportion passing mathematics rose from 36% to 56%, and the proportion passing at least one science tripled from 22% to 68%. These changes were experienced equally by male and female students and by students in Catholic schools to the same extent as in other schools. What's more, the extension of the core academic curriculum was reaching beyond the middle class that used to be its main beneficiaries. For example, by the end of the century, the proportion of working class school leavers who successfully followed a broad academic curriculum in the middle years of secondary was as great as the proportion of middle class leavers who had done so 25 years before. The middle class proportion had also risen, and so inequality of successfully completing a broad academic curriculum had not fallen very much. But that's not the point. The point is that an academic curriculum of a traditional kind turned out not to be intrinsically beyond the reach of working class students. Increasing proportions of students also found the experience of school interesting, telling surveys that they found the school worthwhile, and that's 80% of them said that they found school worthwhile, and 70% thought it taught them things that would be useful in employment. This outcome, this successful outcome of comprehensive schooling up to the 1990s, depended on each step back in the history of what I've been outlining. The expansion of access to an academic curriculum depended on standard grades in the 1980s and O grades in the 1960s. The O grades in the 1960s depended on the experience of creating an intermediate level of access to academic breadth between the 1920s and the 1950s, aspiring to emulate the rigours of the Leaving Certificate. That idea of academic breadth depended on the principle of the socially accessible university, however restricted that principle had been in the 19th century. And the principle of extending that breadth depended on the ideal of the parish school, going right back to the Reformation of 1560. An ideal that, I think it might reasonably be said, was only ever achieved in its full ecumenical and secular form in the development of comprehensive secondary schools with an academic curriculum. But standard grade was the last time in Scottish education policy that the principle of knowledge based on traditions of academic thought was interpreted in a democratic way. Despite the fact that access to this was widening through the 1980s and 1990s with broadly unchanging standards, policymakers at the advent of the Scottish Parliament at the beginning of the century were more impressed by the persisting inequality than by the progress for all social classes, and they seemed oblivious to the growing student satisfaction. They blamed the persisting inequality on the now widely fashionable idea that working class people were inevitably alienated by an academic curriculum based on the knowledge of core subjects. The alternative theory that triumphed was an emphasis on vocational skills. The rejection of the academic tradition was strongly encouraged also by the OECD. It recommended in 2007 for Scotland that vocational courses contain clearer economic incentives for engagement and also involve alternative approaches to learning. The OECD rejected any idea that the traditional Scottish curriculum could embody universal standards that might be relevant to everyone. It saw that as biased in favour of the middle class, describing the Scottish academic tradition like this: a curriculum which was culturally fashioned to meet the needs of more advantaged children and which barred access through the excessive difficulties it presented. So the traditional Scottish curriculum that had survived into the era of comprehensive schooling and that ultimately had its origins in the universities was rejected for being vocationally useless and for being biased towards an elite. The resulting reform is Curriculum for Excellence, which fundamentally shifted the rationale for schooling throughout the age range 3 to 18. So let me illustrate the long-term change embodied in Curriculum for Excellence in some detail from the two core areas of mathematics and English. Describing the changing views of knowledge in general terms from the rhetoric of policy documents, as I've been doing, is not enough. Only in the details of syllabuses can the character of the change be seen in ways that relate directly to the experience of pupils and teachers. For each of these two subject areas, I'll describe some examples from the primary school curriculum and also examples from the syllabuses of the higher grade courses. In mathematics first, the current curriculum differs from its predecessors even in the definition of mathematics. The older curricula described mathematics as a body of knowledge that is independent of the student. For example, the curriculum for ages 5 to 14 that was in place between the late 1980s and 2010 defined mathematics as a body of collected knowledge and procedures for working with patterns and relationships in number and shape. By contrast, the Curriculum for Excellence's general statement about what mathematics is says nothing about a body of knowledge, mentioning only what it enables children and young people to do. This contrast in how mathematics is defined can be brought out by looking at the details of a couple of specific topics from the primary school. One is knowing about how to round numbers, where I'll draw on an analysis by Dr. Sheila Henderson of Dundee University, and the other will be about fractions. In the Curriculum for Excellence, the aim for rounding numbers is vague. All its curricular topics are bizarrely phrased as first-person statements, supposedly in the voice of a pupil, in an attempt to emphasize the acquisition of school. So what it says here about the aim for rounding is phrased like this. I can use my knowledge of rounding to routinely estimate the answers to a problem, then after calculating, decide if my answer is reasonable. I can't, to be honest, imagine any 10-year-old putting their learning goals in that way, but that's how the documents are phrased. As Dr. Henderson says, a teacher whose own understanding of the topic is less than secure may be challenged by what is meant by, I can use my knowledge of rounding. And the reason why primary teachers might need better guidance than this from official documents is that it is possible to enter primary teacher training in Scotland with a bare pass at the current mid-secondary course in mathematics. The advice in the previous curricula was much more specific and therefore more helpful to teachers. For example, in the 5 to 14 curriculum, by the end of primary school, pupils should be able to round any number to the nearest appropriate whole number, 10 or 100. They had built on progressively more demanding exercises at various prior stages in primary. For example, by primary 6, rounding 3-digit whole numbers to the nearest 10. That document is full of these very specific targets, unlike Curriculum for Excellence. Consider now the understanding of fractions that pupils are expected to develop by the end of primary school. Curriculum for Excellence says that the aim in learning about fractions is that I have investigated the everyday context in which simple fractions, percentages or decimal fractions are used and can carry out the necessary calculations to solve related problems. None of that says what knowledge of fractions would amount to. It presupposes some prior agreement among the pupil, the teacher and those who specify the curriculum on what a fraction is and what kinds of fractions should be learnt about. Yet there is nowhere in the curriculum that knowledge is defined. By contrast, all the previous curricula were specific and unambiguous, even to the point of tedium. The 5 to 14 programme specified that pupils should learn by the end of primary about halves, quarters, thirds, fifths, eighths, tenths, 20s, 50s, hundreds, and also equivalencies. And the simpler types should be first encountered early in primary and then repeatedly reinforced. And there are similar detailed specifications in the curricula that go right back to the middle of the 20th century. Now, these were examples from mathematics at the quite basic level of what should be learnt by age around 12. The contrast is, if anything, even more stark at the much more advanced level of higher mathematics. We can compare, for example, the syllabus for 1983 with that of 40 years later, the one still current that was first introduced in 2023. In 1983, the idea of deriving from first principles pervades every section of the syllabus: algebra, calculus, geometry, and trigonometry. This idea never appears in 2024. And here are some specific examples. In 1983, under calculus, the student is expected to determine from first principles the derivatives of polynomials and trigonometric functions. In 2024, the student is expected to be able to calculate these derivatives, but not to derive them, an applied skill, not an abstract one. In 1983, the student is expected to be able to prove the necessary and sufficient conditions for two straight lines to be perpendicular to each other. In 2024, the student is expected only to be able to use that theorem to calculate the gradient of a line that is perpendicular to a given line. This is again an applied skill, not mathematics. Moreover, whole segments of theory that were present in 1983 are simply absent in 2024 with no compensating additions. For example, matrices, vectors, and algebraic geometry were a strong presence in 1983, but absent or severely attenuated in 2024. Altogether, in fact, the 2024 specification for higher mathematics is more reminiscent of the 1983 specification for O-grade than the 1983 specification for higher. The O-grade requirements were mainly about skills. An analogous contrast of knowledge and skills is found in English. For example, consider what the Curriculum for Excellence says about the kinds of text that in English that should be studied in English in primary and early secondary. The list includes, amongst other types, novels, short stories, plays, poems and reference texts, advertisements and promotional leaflets, text messages, blogs, and social networking sites. Now, it is, of course, a very good idea that the English classroom should pay attention to informal language as well as to literary text. But what is noticeably absent in the Curriculum for Excellence definitions is any evaluation. Any sense that novels, short stories, plays or poems might actually be superior in form and content to everyday text, and that studying these forms might be rather more educative than studying the mundane. One result is then that by the third year of secondary school, the Curriculum for Excellence aims in this connection become entirely focused on the students' personal predilections, not on their educated knowledge. The aim at that stage is formulated as this, like this. I regularly select and read, listen to or watch texts for enjoyment and interest, and I can express how well they meet my needs and expectations and give reasons why, with evidence, they do so for my personal response. There's not even a hint here that the student might grow as a person through studying a canon of great writers. Again, the comparison with the preceding curricula is striking. As with mathematics, the 5 to 14 curriculum specified what is to be learnt by listing knowledge that is independent of the student. It said the text may be a poem, an illustrated page from a children's book, a spoken message, a novel, a television programme, or a scene from a dramatic performance. Thus, for example, by the end of primary school, a pupil in that 5 to 14 curriculum should be able to read a variety of texts and show that they understand the gist of the text, its main ideas or feelings, and can obtain particular information, and can understand and can use at least the following terms: theme, character, relationship, setting, motives, fact, and opinion. These are all independent of the student's own feelings or identity. Curriculum for Excellence also gives scant attention to formal structure of language. A typically vague statement for the early secondary stages is this: through developing my knowledge of context clues, punctuation, grammar, and layout, I can read unfamiliar text with increasing fluency, understanding, and expression. There is no specification at all of what aspects of grammar, punctuation, and so on are to be learnt. Previous curricula were more specific. In 5 to 14, by the end of primary, pupils ought to know, understand, and use at least the following terms: vowel and consonant, adjective, adverb, pronoun, and conjunction, masculine and feminine, singular and plural, tense, paragraph. In the curriculum that came before 5 to 14, from 1965 onwards, although it said punctuation is conventional, children have to become aware that in writing, intelligibility can often be ensured only by means of correct punctuation, and writing in an acceptable form requires correct spelling. At the level of higher English, the main contrasts are in linguistic rigour and in the assumption of background knowledge. In 1983, the general rubric for the examination paper at higher that assessed students' knowledge of literature said this: credit will be given for thorough knowledge of the selected text or texts, awareness of the techniques used, sincerity of personal response, competence in written English, and evidence of wide and independent reading. The importance of wide and independent reading in 1983 was greatest in the essay paper, where candidates had to compose 2 essays on unseen topics specified in the examination, such as under the headings of reflective essay, narrative, and personal memoir, but the specific questions were not advertised in advance. In 2024, there is no parallel to this expectation of wide reading for the literature paper, and instead of unseen essay questions, there is the portfolio, which is composed during the school year outside examination conditions. There is no requirement in the portfolio of being prepared to write in a variety of forms, and the topic is wholly under the choice of the students. These then have been merely some illustrations in detail from 2 subjects of the inadequacy of Curriculum for Excellence. Its main defect is that it expresses almost everything in terms of the student rather than in terms of knowledge independent of the student that must be learnt. This is the main reason that the curriculum is so dominated by skills, because skills seem to be more amenable to expression in this way. Skills can be described as attributes of the student rather than as characteristics that are independent of the student. Of course, real skills are as objective as knowledge. There are real objective criteria in being able to bake a cake or conduct a scientific experiment, but Curriculum for Excellence pays little attention to the objective character of skills either. They are primarily to be seen as expressions of the student's identity. So, in the name of promoting useful skills and of overthrowing the supposed social class bias of an academic curriculum, Curriculum for Excellence has emptied the official curriculum of sustained, structured, meaningful, and difficult content. The result has been the fall in attainment mentioned in the introduction and the rise of social inequality. Let me now summarise the evidence I've presented and draw some conclusions about its implications. It's difficult to resist the judgment on Curriculum for Excellence of Dr. Stuart Farmer of the Institute of Physics. He said, with the almost exclusive focus on skills, knowledge is not being developed in a coherent, progressive, and carefully planned way as our children and young people progress through their schooling. Lying behind what has happened in Scottish school education is, of course, a real dilemma: how to extend high-quality education to the majority. In the 19th century and earlier, Scottish education was well ahead of international developments in its provision of a sound basic education to every child, laying the basis for Scotland's reputation as one of the best educated societies in Europe at that time, rivaling the other Northern European systems. That distinction of participation rates was lost as all European and North American countries caught up by the first part of the 20th century, and the rest of the world has followed suit in the second half of the 20th century. In the 20th century and until the 1970s, Scottish education served the most able very well by international standards. That's how the modern reputation has been sustained, even while the performance of the majority of its pupils was no better than average internationally, although no worse in the 1960s and 1970s. But that distinction too has been lost, because even the best 10% have steadily declining attainment by international standards. The reason it has been lost is in large part due to a well-intentioned misunderstanding. The belief came to dominate policy, inspired by the OECD and others, that the way to extend the curriculum to everyone was to change the curriculum. That was appealing to urgent radicals and impatient politicians. If an academically challenging curriculum can be blamed as alien to children from socially disadvantaged backgrounds, then a neat solution to inequality might seem to be to abandon academic challenge. If doing so also can have the seeming bonus of strengthening vocational skills, then there might be an economic benefit as well. In truth, though, that diagnosis of the origins of educational disadvantage was deeply misguided, as in fact the first couple of decades of Scottish comprehensive schooling had shown. Proceeding with an essentially unchanged academic curriculum, comprehensive schooling was in fact raising the attainment of social groups which had previously been excluded, and students increasingly found school to be satisfactory. But the progress was slow, as all worthwhile social change is. With the advent of the Scottish Parliament in 1999, radical impatience won out, and Curriculum for Excellence was born. Finally then, why does this matter? It matters because, as abundant psychological research shows, structured knowledge matters. Without knowledge, skills are no better than trial and error. The structure of knowledge underlies memory and thus underlies all sustained learning. Knowledge matters because the knowledge that defines the various subject disciplines is the only way to set educationally meaningful targets for students and to assess their progress towards them. Knowledge matters because it begets further knowledge. That's because only knowledge enables us to understand what we read and hear. Without prior knowledge, what I look up on Google in the search for new knowledge makes no sense at all. Knowledge matters because it is emancipating. The curriculum of schools is the only source of systematic knowledge for children who do not get it from home. Knowledge matters because it is the basis of creativity when a thorough understanding of distinct disciplines is used to link them imaginatively together. And knowledge matters because it confers power, conceptual power, but also political power in understanding how society works. So knowledge widely dispersed is the very basis of a civic democracy, enabling everyone to avoid falling into John Stuart Mill's trap of being duped by charlatans and impostors. Structured knowledge, organized into disciplines that have been formed and recurrently refined over centuries, is the best tool which human beings have ever invented. Scotland used to know that and needs to discover it again. Thank you.
Okay, everybody. Question and answer time. There are Pat and Richard with the roving microphones. Remember, hold them like this, and let's go.
Thank you very much for the talk. It's very interesting. I wonder what you think the role of AI in ChatGPT might have, because hearing you speak, it makes me wonder that the acquisition of knowledge becomes even cheaper, and therefore it diminishes further the problem, or so it exacerbates further the problem that you've highlighted.
Yeah. Can I just, will I take question one by one, or do you want to take groups of questions? What would be the
one
by one? Okay, that's fine. Yes, of course. Very happy to try to answer that. We'll try to answer, because I'm not a computer scientist. I don't know how AI works. I have no idea what is meant by the apparently attractive term large language model. But what I think maybe I can speculate about is the implications for education. Now, clearly, there are two, I think, major implications. One is the most obvious one, which is about the authenticity of assessment. It seems to me there are only two ways now in which we can proceed with valid assessment, because it's so easy to generate plausible answers using AI. One way is to add to every essay we expect a student to submit, every lab report they are expected to submit, every practical in medicine or any other field, an oral examination. Now, in theory, we could do that. But if you work out a simple fact, suppose you had a first-year undergraduate class of 300 students, each expected to submit an essay of, say, 3,000 words. That would probably require somewhere in the region of 100 hours of staff time orally supplementing the written essays to check that the student really had written the essay and understood what had been written. So I think in present circumstances, it's simply not possible to go down that route of assessment, that is, of supplementing written stuff with an oral exam to test whether it was actually written by the student. The only other way to do it, therefore, is to return again to invigilated closed book exams. In other words, the kind of thing that we all used to sit and that no longer is fashionable in universities and increasingly is not even fashionable in schools. I can't see any other way of doing valid assessment other than returning to invigilated exams. So that's one implication. Now, that's in a sense the most negative implication, and it's also the one that would be most controversial, because those of you who are not involved in education might find it slightly surprising that what I've just said about exams is deeply, deeply controversial. Exams are deeply unpopular, they're regarded as reactionary, elitist, and so on and so forth. And actually, of course, they're amongst the most emancipating forms of assessment we can get, because people doing exams are equal in the exam room. They cannot get either formal or informal support from families and communities. But anyway, that's controversial, but that's a negative point. The positive point is this. AI is here. It's not going to go away. There was a survey the other day, I think, which showed that about 90% of undergraduate students are actively using a lot of AI. They're doing it. Of course, that's great. So what we have to do is find a way of using AI as a pedagogical tool. There's lots of ways of doing that, but I think one way of thinking about it is as an analogy with mentoring. We would, in many, many subjects, we expect people to treat established members of that discipline as a bit like apprentice masters in old-fashioned apprenticeships. We tend to use the word apprentice, of course, only in relation to practical skills, but really it applies to all forms of worthwhile learning. So the budding doctor learns from the established medic. The budding mathematician learns from working with an experienced mathematician, the budding linguist learns by conversation with people who are fluent in the language. Now, there is no reason why that source of mentoring couldn't also be generated to some extent by AI tools. So we say, the teacher then would say, right, use AI to generate a good essay on some question. Let us say, how do we solve the problem of President Trump? And of course, AI will produce a plausible answer, but the question is not the answer that AI produces, it's then how does the student engage with the arguments that are put forward by that plausible answer? And that plausible answer will have been generated from lots of other people around the world who have generated answers to that kind of question in the internet. That's how AI works. And of course, then the learning point is not what the AI has generated. That's the starting point of the learning. The learning is engaging with what the AI has produced. Now, this is going to require a lot of new skills by teachers, whether at university or school, but I think it can be done, and it can be a very constructive use of AI, but it has to be done very carefully, I think, and we're only at the beginning of that process.
Thank you for that. I've just got a question about the socioeconomic attainment gap, because I think that's quite a key feature in tackling education in Scotland. And I think you'd focus quite a lot on the different curricula across the decades.
Yes.
I think that what would actually make more of a difference than the change in curricula is tackling poverty in
Yes.
working class communities.
Yes.
For example, you mentioned in the 1960s, it was mainly middle class children qualifying for university, as working class children never really succeeded in primary school. Is this mainly because working class children would have been encouraged by their families out of necessity due to poverty to leave schooling as early as possible to bring money into the household? So rather than being about academic competence, schooling was more seen as an unattainable goal for many and not worth pursuing. You also mentioned then, moving on to the 1980s, that the attainment in secondary schooling started to fall during that decade. And this kind of coincides with the industry in many working class towns and communities being gutted. For example, in Clydebank, where the shipyards were closed, communities therefore had less wealth, and so children were left school prematurely so they could start work to provide for the household yet again. Do you recognise this as a feature of the attainment gap based on class historically and then now today? And what policies would you put forward to mitigate this feature out with changing the curricula? Thank you.
Absolutely agree with everything that you've just said, that the source of inequality is poverty, and the source of poverty is ultimately a lack of money. It's really quite simple as that, and the lack of money comes from deep inequalities, partly entrenched in a particular economic system, but partly also because of the particular destruction of communities and communities of work that you mentioned in the second part of your question. So one answer to the question is, if we reduce poverty, and we will reduce inequality of learning, because it will no longer be necessary for people to leave education at the first opportunity because their families or they themselves can't afford to stay on any longer. In the history of Scottish education, of course, some of the most emancipating steps that were not taken by the state in this respect. They were taken by the Carnegie Trust. You kindly mentioned that I had family affinities with this city. My father was from this city, and he grew up in a very poor family in Bridgeton. And he only could get to university because, first of all, he went to Whitehill Secondary School, which is one of these new secondary schools that I mentioned earlier on, that was free and that encouraged working class boys and girls to aspire. But also, the reason he could then go to Glasgow University as a student was because of the Carnegie Trust. He got a grant that paid enough of his fees that with work every holiday and every weekend enabled him to stay right through and eventually become an English teacher. I should say too, like many of his fellows, this was done on either side of the war, so it was a highly interrupted experience. Now, all of that was made possible because of a belief that financial restrictions should not stand in the way of able people going as far as they could go in education. But the emphasis was very much on removing financial obstacles. And I think that ultimately is, if you look at the whole century then, that one of the major reasons why inequality has been reduced is it's been made possible for people to stay on in school without causing their families enormous financial hardship, and then to go to university if that's what they're able to do without having to incur enormous debts. The idea, for example, by the way, of reducing the school leaving age doesn't seem to be consistent with that particular history. But all of that depends on it being financially possible for people to do it. I think I would add one final point in relation to your answer. It's, although the evidence seems to me compellingly from Scotland and indeed from other systems that have been studied around the world, along the lines that I've said, that there is no intrinsic hurdle for children from working class families engaging with academic knowledge, although that is evident from all over the world. Nevertheless, I think whole communities can kind of be depressed in their aspirations by the process of deindustrialization, of the destruction of traditional cultures and so on. So there is something beyond just the purely economic, and that too has to be worked with. That's why there was always a role for community education, or adult education as it used to be called, which worked with people who had not gone to school beyond the minimum leaving age and had not gone to university, nevertheless to re-engage with education later on. That too is something that we have lost and we really should regain if possible. So thanks for your question.
Where do you see the required Where do you see the required intellectual leadership in Scottish education coming from?
Sorry, I missed.
Where do you see the required intellectual leadership in Scottish education coming from?
Teachers. So the question would then be, how do we move from where we are? As usual with academics, I'm good at saying what's bad, what's wrong, but I have not said what could or should happen. The only feasible way to move ahead is to put further change in the hands of teachers and schools, but I include within teachers, of course, head teachers and school management. One reason for that is purely pragmatic. Another big centrally directed reform imposed from the centre, even if it was well-intentioned, will be met with rebellion by teachers, having already gone through the chaos, not just of Curriculum for Excellence and all the reforms to the exams associated with that, but also, of course, COVID. But also more practically, it's pretty clear that teachers around Scotland know that there is a problem. They also know, of course, that part of the problem is manifested in enormous levels of indiscipline and worrying levels of non-attendance at school. That's not entirely because of the curriculum, but nevertheless that doesn't help. Teachers know what the problems are, and if policymakers would more listen to what teachers are saying, and to the extent that this is feasible, put teachers in charge of further reform, then it might be more possible to get a reform that respects teachers' respect for knowledge and would actually work in the classroom. Now, by putting teachers in charge, I don't mean the rather vacuous rhetoric that you do find in Curriculum for Excellence documents that says that every teacher can invent their own curriculum. That's completely wasteful and actually pointless. What I mean by that is a reform, let us say, to the physics curriculum should happen through groups of physicists, physics teachers, coming together across Scotland with appropriate experts from research activities in universities to be up to date with the state of the science, to devise a syllabus that would work across the 450 or so secondary school physics departments of Scotland. That's what I mean by leadership by physics teachers, and the same would be true right across the board. That doesn't cost very much. It costs what it would cost to release these teachers from some part of their timetable to enable them to engage in such meetings. A small amount is needed to bring people together, although a lot of the work could be done by electronic communication. Now, none of this would be guaranteed first time round to produce a perfect curriculum. Of course it wouldn't. So in addition to that, it's also necessary to have means by which that mechanism I've just described can experiment with new ways of doing it and properly evaluate the experiments. Some of the experiments will fail, many of them will work, and then the good ones can be disseminated right around the system. And of course, at the same time, where possible, learning from other countries as well. Now that process would be slow and gradual. It's not going to be an overnight change. It will take at least 20 years to rectify the 20-year problem that Curriculum for Excellence has created. But it's going to have to develop in some kind of way because there's no other body of expert knowledge than the teachers about what's wrong and what can be done.
Thank you for that talk. You mentioned indiscipline a moment ago.
Yes.
I saw an article in the papers today saying that the majority of teachers have suffered physical violence in the classroom in recent years. Surely that is an even bigger problem than any gaps in the curriculum.
Yeah, it absolutely is. You can't do anything if you have people throwing things and assaulting you and bullying other children and so on and so forth, and with having almost no sanctions to impose on that. So before we can even get to that, I completely agree. The indiscipline problem, and I would also add the non-attendance problem, the fact that a very large number of students are simply not attending, some 40%, missing at least a day a fortnight, for example. These are the two biggest issues facing Scottish education. My talk tonight is on the curriculum, but I don't mean to imply that that's the biggest immediate issue. It is absolutely that. Now, the only way that the indiscipline problem can be dealt with, I can't think of any other way than the possibility of much harsher sanctions. No doubt somebody will tell me this isn't feasible, but it seems to me that if somebody assaults somebody else in a school, in other words, somebody does something that in a court of law would be a crime, the only response from the management should be immediate suspension and with no recourse. And then some way of working with that person to re-engage them. Because if you don't do that, then the victims of that bullying or assault, which might include the teacher, of course, continue to have to face the perpetrator day in, day out, which is going to harm their learning and their self-confidence and their well-being much more than the self-confidence and well-being of the perpetrator. Now, sometimes the perpetrator, there's a good reason for that, as there is with any criminal justice system. There are ways of working with people to reform them rather than simply to punish them, and that's particularly important when we're talking about adolescents or children. But that's something that then happens outside the classroom, so that the learning of the majority isn't continually disrupted and the well-being of the teacher isn't continually assaulted by that kind of activity.
Thank you. The views of the OECD seem to have been very influential in Scotland, but they seem to me to be rather generic and could apply to many nations' education systems. So were the OECD views also applied to other nations, or were they differentially adopted in Scotland?
They were differentially adopted. The OECD goes around the world telling all countries what I summarised for Scotland, that an academic curriculum is fundamentally alienating to working class children or other marginalised social groups, and that vocational education is the only motivating as well as only the only useful form of education. Some governments refuse to accept that. Our most immediate neighbour has recently refused to accept that, England. It will be interesting to see. There's a current review of the curriculum going on that was instigated by the new Labour government in England, and it will be interesting to see what that review has to say. I would be astonished if they were to go down the same kind of road as Curriculum for Excellence, because all parts of the political spectrum in England have accepted that the OECD is wrong in that respect. But more relevantly, you can look at places that I mentioned very briefly: Estonia, Singapore, Japan. These are places, Poland, Massachusetts. These are places which have refused to accept the standard OECD view that I've summarised for Scotland. So I think it's political determination. That's the level at which politics really does matter. Incidentally, if I might add to that, and answer both to that question and to one earlier on, how do we change things? I actually don't think that the politicians are the main source of what's happened or the main source of change. Politicians, on the whole, don't want to get involved in the details of education, and that's absolutely proper, because if politicians get involved in education, then politics affects the curriculum, and that becomes a deeply dangerous activity in a liberal society. What politicians do, of course, is hand over a lot of the power over the curriculum to unelected bodies, in this case in Scotland, Education Scotland and the Scottish Qualifications Authority. That happens in many countries. Politicians can give general direction to these bodies, but not into the details. So what tends to happen in other countries is not that politicians get involved in the details of the curriculum, as would be improper in a democracy, but rather that they instruct the curricular bodies that they're not going to go down the route recommended by OECD, but are rather going to go down a route of a knowledge-based curriculum of the kind that I've been implicitly advocating here. So that's the role for politics, but it does require the politicians to stand up to the international fashion promulgated by the OECD and the international fashion, it has to be said, of many of my fellow academics. I should have said, by the way, that my view is a very small minority amongst academics in education.
We'll maybe take an online question.
To what extent is the decline in Scotland's PISA scores, or the PISA scores for Scottish students, due to it testing for knowledge rather than testing for skills?
Well, PISA claims to test for skills. The whole rhetoric of the PISA studies is that it assesses knowledge as it might be useful, not just knowledge in an abstract academic way, but useful knowledge. So the first thing to say in reply to that is that PISA specifically tries to test the very sorts of learning which Curriculum for Excellence claims to be enabling. So even in that context, Scotland has declined. I think the other thing to say, of course, is that there are many ways of assessing what people have learnt, and these big international studies are only one way of doing that. But nevertheless, in the absence of anything else, and there isn't anything else, they're the only criterion that we can go with. If somebody could come up with a feasible, different way of assessing skills, in other words, ones that, even though starting from the same aims of PISA in assessing skills, nevertheless assess skills in a different way, then it would be very interesting to see what has happened. But everybody that has attempted to do comparative study of the acquisition of skills, as PISA tries to do, ends up with something like the PISA tests. So it's very difficult. Now, if we're not willing to do tests, if we're not willing to compare evidence, statistical evidence of that kind, then we might as well give up trying to learn anything about what works in education and what doesn't. We end up just guessing. Now, that's not adequate because, of course, the products of our education system do have to go and compete in the labour market and in other ways with the products of other education systems. So the products of Scottish schools go to England to get jobs or to go to university. The products of Scottish universities go to get jobs in the rest of the UK and in many other parts of the world. And they will be competing with people who have been educated in much more knowledge-rich types of system, places such as England, for example, or Poland or Singapore or Korea. And in these kinds of contexts, if you haven't got an adequate grounding in knowledge, then you're going to lose out in the jobs. So in that sense, even if we don't have tests of the kind that PISA provide us with, there is a real practical test of what happens over time, slowly over time, with the products of one education system rather than another.
Thank you. And another question online. You've alluded to solving the problem of Donald Trump. Does this knowledge skills difference suggest that the American system is also skills-based, given that so many people seem to be so easily duped?
Well, John Stuart Mill would certainly agree. Although John Stuart Mill's point about being duped by charlatans and imposters would probably apply most explicitly to Trump's new Secretary for Health, Kennedy, rather than to Trump himself, who doesn't, at least I don't suppose Trump aspires to be knowledgeable. But it's easy to make fun of Trump, and of course that's good fun. It's not so easy, of course, to make fun of the people that voted for Trump, because 52% of that democracy voted for Trump. So one of the questions that has to be asked then, given that American education, with a few exceptions, and I mentioned Massachusetts, with a few exceptions, has been developing an essentially skills-based curricula for decades, and which has departed from the idea of a canon of knowledge, whether in literature or in any other sphere, for decades, whether that ultimately is one of the many explanations for why that founding democracy has ended up with an election outcome like we've just had. Doesn't seem to me sufficient to blame the 52% who voted for Trump, or the 52% of 60% who voted for Trump, or the 30-40% who didn't vote at all, to blame them for a particular outcome. It is possible, I'm not saying this is the only explanation, but that an inadequate education system leads people to being much more open to rather simplistic political solutions, rather than to consider the truly enormously difficult questions of how to choose our leaders in a democracy. And it could be that that's part of the explanation, but that is a far more difficult proposition than simply to say that they were all wrong, even though they might be regarded as misguided.
Thank you very much for that talk, which I think I might be able to speak for everyone here, really showed what has been obvious to all for a long time. Is there an element of, instead of encouraging aspiration, is there an element of lowering the bar to make people feel as though they have achieved, when what they've achieved really isn't so great?
Yeah, I mentioned briefly at the end the psychological research that shows that a knowledge-based curriculum is more effective. There's lots of aspects of that, but one aspect of that research is that it's kind of stating the obvious, but if you continually tell a child that everything they do is great, then when they truly do something great, they don't know how to distinguish that from having done something trivial. So that and to do that, what you need, of course, in constructing a curriculum over whatever it is, 12 or 13 years of schooling, is a series of increasingly difficult hurdles that people have to overcome. And that has to be designed from the beginning to the end. It's one of the reasons, by the way, why to design a primary school mathematics curriculum, it's not enough just to have a bare pass in National 5 mathematics. You've got to know what goes beyond that in order to know what the steps are going to lead to. Now that means, of course, that you can say to somebody, that's great, I was going to say you've mastered long division, but nobody ever does that now. You've mastered fractions, whatever. You're able to do fractions. You've understood trigonometry. You've understood the sine rule or something like that. That's great. That's worth celebrating because it's actually quite difficult from the start. But it's only the beginning of anything beyond that. And if you really want to stop there, that's fine, and go on and do something else that you enjoy much more. That's also fine. But nevertheless, don't think that just being able to do the sine rule is the pinnacle of mathematical achievement. It's not. It's quite good, but it's not great. Similarly, if you can read Le Monde in French, then that's good. That's about what I can do, but it's not great. I don't delude myself into thinking that I'm fluent in French just because I can go to Paris and read Le Monde. That's a pretty low-level skill, since I can't even speak like Le Monde, far less write like that. So I think that getting in perspective moderate levels of achievement oddly enough, would actually be a better step towards high levels of achievement than telling everyone that what they're doing is great. Of course, right back at the beginning, learning to speak at all is great. At that moment, it is great, but it immediately has to be followed by what comes next. This one down here.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. I just want to know, what can the Scottish Government do to make the Scottish education system great again?
I would settle for it being adequate again, but it doesn't make a good slogan. So what they can do, I think, would be along the lines that I've suggested. There needs to be a new way of discovering the importance of knowledge. Knowledge only makes sense when it's structured into subjects, as we tend to call them in schools, or disciplines, as we tend to call them in universities. I mean, some academics make an enormous play of the difference between a subject and a discipline. I don't see the distinction. A subject is essentially a distillation to various levels of children's schooling of the disciplines that we talk about in the university. So I'll call them disciplines. So the knowledge has to be structured into disciplines. So the structure of mathematics is not the same as the structure of medicine or the structure of music or the structure of French. So you have to do it in that kind of way. Now, if we accept that proposition, that the structure, that we need knowledge, A, and B, that the structure of knowledge, the nature of knowledge depends on the disciplines, then the only people that can solve the problem are the people who are the experts in the disciplines. Now, there is a distinction, and this is a valuable academic distinction, between knowledge of a discipline and what's in the jargon is called pedagogical content knowledge. So I can know mathematics, but that doesn't automatically mean that I know how to teach mathematics, because to be able to teach mathematics, I need to know what works, what kind of teaching strategies work in teaching people of various prior abilities mathematics, what typical mistakes does a 14-year-old or a 24-year-old or an adult learner of mathematics tend to make, because then I can work to not just anticipate these mistakes, but actually correct them, get the student to learn from the mistake. That's what's meant by pedagogical content knowledge, the linking up of particular steps in the discipline with the typical opportunities and constraints for learning in a particular age group. Now, the people that know about that are the teachers. They know about it in theory, many of them anyway, because they've studied it, and they certainly know about it in practice because they've been doing it. So although there will have to be other guidance as well, you can't revise the syllabus of, let us say, biology without having contact now with really up-to-date genetics, and that requires contact with the geneticists in universities like this one. So there has to be also involvement from appropriate advanced specialists in these subjects. But of course, the majority on such a development committee would have to be people with immediate current experience of teaching in a school classroom. Now that can be brought together by government. So that's my answer to your question, what can government do? It can facilitate, it can lead, it can provide the really quite minimal resources required to enable that kind of networking committee to work and to make proposals and to evaluate proposals and then help to extend them to other schools. It's pretty minimal. It's not very costly. It costs a few £1 million a year. Trivial. Rounding error, actually.
Guy, thank you. I was curious, with the growing body of evidence of a skills-based curriculum growing, showing that it's not effective, what are the proponents of that, that type of curriculum saying? Are they saying that it's not being implemented correctly, or...?
Sorry, I missed this. There was a fan came on there. Could you say the first part? I'm terribly sorry, I didn't.
I was wondering, as the evidence for a skills-based curriculum is not being effective, is growing, right. What are proponents of that system saying? Okay, yes, thank you.
So basically, how do the defenders of the curriculum act? Right, they act in three ways, I think. One is to deny there's a problem. And they deny there's a problem by using the statistics that are regularly churned out by the Scottish Government, such as the lot that came out last week on leavers' attainment and initial destinations. This is a whole other story, but the quality of Scottish educational statistics is absolutely abysmal. I won't go into details on this, but it is impossible, for example, to give you one example. In Scotland believes we've discussed this tonight already, that social inequality of progression in education is a very serious problem, inequality. And yet, social inequality, so let's call it social class, because that's an unfashionable term that doesn't get bandied around. So we'll say social class inequality of progress and attainment is one of the major problems facing Scottish education. There is no valid and reliable way of measuring social class in any Scottish Government statistic whatsoever. They use a thing called the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. Now that's quite good for measuring the overall characteristics of a neighbourhood, like Castlemilk, for example, or Hillhead. That's great for that purpose, but it takes no account of the enormous variation of social circumstances of people living in Hillhead or living in Castlemilk. And in particular, at least around 2/3 of people, that's young people living in families in poverty, do not live in the most socially deprived fifth of neighbourhoods. Now, think about that. Because all the Scottish Government education inequality statistics talk about the 5/5 measured by the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. So they compare people living in the most deprived fifth with people living in the most advantaged fifth. But nearly 2/3 of the actually deprived families don't live in the fifth most deprived neighbourhoods. So when we're talking about the attainment of the most deprived fifth, we're missing 2/3 of the most deprived families. Now that's just one specific example of what's wrong, but nevertheless, that's what they retreat to. It is perfectly possible, and there's evidence to show this, that a lot of the apparent narrowing of inequality is entirely, for example, in access to universities, is entirely because universities like mine, and I suspect this one too, cherry pick the minority of non-deprived children living in the most deprived neighbourhoods, because the corollary of what I've just said, that 2/3 of deprived people don't live in the deprived neighbourhoods, is that around 1/4 of the people living in deprived neighbourhoods are not in any measure deprived. They, in fact, have parents who have been to university, for example. So Edinburgh University cherry picks the minority of children who come from the non-deprived families living in the deprived neighbourhoods, and according to Scottish Government, that represents a narrowing of inequality. But it clearly isn't. And I'm saying that not rhetorically. There is hard statistical evidence that that is exactly one of the things that is going on in apparently narrowing inequality. So that's one defence that is made, that things are actually getting better. Of course, another part of that is they say the number of people getting higher X is rising over the years. But of course, from what I've said, you may begin to wonder whether that is actually due to making the hires easier to pass rather than because of any rise in attainment. The second thing that is said, this is really quite magical. The official line from the EIS, the Teachers' Trade Union, is that there's nothing wrong with curriculum for excellence because we don't actually have true curriculum for excellence. In other words, that the utopian vision that was promulgated in 2004 or 2010 when it officially started has something that has never come to pass because of government policies, because of expenditure restrictions, because of COVID, because of the financial crash of 2008 and so on and so forth. So that the official line from Andrea Bradley, who is the chief executive of the EIS, is that there is nothing wrong with curriculum for excellence because we don't have curriculum for excellence. The fact, of course, that every single one of the financial and social problems that I've mentioned equally affect England, and yet inequality in England is going the other way, and PISA results are improving in England is of course not paid attention to. But that's the second response that is given, that we can't say there's anything wrong with curriculum for excellence any more than we could say there was anything wrong with socialism because of Stalin. The third rationale that is produced, and this is the most, I suppose, respectable rationale, is this, that actually we shouldn't worry about a decline in academic standards because academic standards are far less important than vocational skills or than student well-being or than the capacity to integrate socially into a well-functioning democratic community. Now, that I think is a respectable defence. The problem is it doesn't work actually either. There is absolutely no evidence that the PISA studies are mainly about attainment, but there is actually also a segment in the PISA studies that asks things about, for example, well-being. And the difference between Scotland and England in this respect is absolutely minimal, even though the English approach is completely different. So, for example, here's just one off the top of my head here. In the most recent PISA study, students were asked, do they agree with the statement, I feel like I belong when I'm at school? Now, in the the notion that Curriculum for Excellence is about creating a community of learning that is much better for people's well-being and so forth, you would expect it to be a lot better in Scotland. Well, the proportion agreeing that I belong at school was 67% in Scotland and 63% in England. And that's a small difference. Maybe it's to do with Curriculum for Excellence, but it's not an enormous difference. And the same is true across a whole range of other measures. And similarly, in 2018, this doesn't happen every round of PISA, but in 2018, there was a question about, a module of questions in the PISA study about what the OECD called, in PISA called global citizenship. And it tested people on their knowledge of things like environmental policy, of the interdependence of countries in trade, the contribution of economic development to the environmental problems, the way in which cheap clothes here, for example, depend on sweated labour in Asia, that kind of thing. So that's what was meant by global citizenship. Now, Scotland did quite well, but that's kind of beside the point because hardly any countries took part in this. And in particular, all the academically best performing countries in Europe did not take part in that test. So that, can set that aside. Scotland doing well on that doesn't prove anything. So the real question is then the attitudinal questions. And the young people in Scotland did have admirable liberal views. For example, they had very much more positive views than the average across the rest of Europe. I should have said the rest of the UK didn't take part in any of this, but other parts of Europe that didn't take the tests of global competence did administer the opinion questionnaires to the students. So about 20 European Union countries did that. And one of the sets of questions was asked about attitudes to immigrants. Children from immigrant families. And Scotland had far and away really very strikingly liberal, respectful attitudes towards immigrants, very much more positive and liberal and respectful than the average across Europe. But, this is the key point from the point of view of education policy, the students were then asked, were they learning about these things in school? And Scotland was worse than the European average. So although Scottish young people were more liberal and respectful and tolerant than the average young person across Europe, Scottish young people were less likely to report that they got that liberal tolerance from their schools than young people in the rest of Europe. So the very thing that Curriculum for Excellence can be defended on, which is creating a society of democratic, respectful, liberal citizens, is not what is actually creating a society of democratic, respectful, liberal young people in Scotland. It's something else, their own social networks, presumably. So I don't find any of the three defences credible. The last one is the one that deserves most respect. I think the other two are really quite ridiculous, actually. But they're the common ones.
Yes. First of all, make a comment going back to the very first question about AI.
Of course.
In my part of this university, which is biology,
yes,
we had to make a very quick switch with final year students back to an in-hall exam.
Yes.
And the thing that most worried many of them, was that they felt they couldn't write for 3 hours anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that was one of
true.
the things they needed to practice.
Yes, indeed.
But the question I wanted to ask you was about rote learning. I remember in primary school, for me that was enjoyable and fun, but big part of, say, maths, we're learning tables and so on. Do you think there's still a role for rote learning?
Again, the psychological research is absolutely clear. There certainly is a role for rote learning. I'll come back to how that's done in a second, but the reason there isn't a role for rote learning is that it's extremely inefficient. If you don't have multiplication tables firmly cemented in your mind, it's inefficient because when later you encounter something that is effectively a multiplication, then you have to go back through working out what the answer is. That's extremely inefficient. So you by rote learning something at one stage in your learning, it then becomes part of your immediate recall when you encounter the use of that thing later on. The same is true, for example, if you're learning irregular French verbs, or if you're learning elements of the periodic table. If you had to keep on looking these things up every time you encountered them, your subsequent learning would be enormously slowed down. And the reason, by the way, that matters is that the research on the memory, learning is all about putting things into the memory. The research on memory says that there are two kinds of human memory. There's long-term memory, which is probably infinite in its capacity, but then there's the working memory, which isn't. We can probably all hold at most about 5 different things in our working memory at any one time, and these things fade after about 30 seconds. And the only way into long-term memory is through the working memory. This also applies to physical memory as well, but I'm just thinking about conceptual memory at the moment. So what you've got to do then is try to make it more efficient to use your working memory. Now, if you don't, for example, if you see a situation in which you have to know that 6 times 7 is 42, if you can't immediately bring that to mind and you have to work out what 6 times 7 is, then you're using up at least one slot and probably more than one slot of the 5 slots in your working memory, which reduces your capacity to learn something new via your working memory in which the 6 times 7 thing has arisen. So it's more efficient to have created out of 6 times 7 a single thing called 42 and then retrieve that from the long-term memory than it is to have to every time go through the calculation of 6 times 7. That's just one very trivial example. But it's because of the limitations of working memory that it's useful to have things cemented in our minds. Now, of course, how to teach this is a completely different matter. And I'm not a primary school teacher, and it's an enormous and thankless task. I mean, obviously, one thing that primary teachers traditionally have done extremely well and still do today in teaching rote learning is through music. You chant the tables. You chant the irregular verbs, if that's the kind of subject you're doing. You play games to cement these things in memory, because there are lots of ways of getting young children to put up with the chore, but in the end, it is a chore. So another thing that curriculum for excellence, it seems to me, is fundamentally wrong in is supposing that all learning can be enjoyable, and it can be enjoyable at the moment at which you're doing it. Some learning is inescapably boring, tedious, and frustrating. We all have to do that all the time, and the more we tell young people it's not going to be like that, the more we do them a disservice, I think, actually.
Right, we've got time for one more question, folks. The gentleman over there with his hand up.
Thank you for the talk. I hope this question isn't too vague, but I enjoyed the definition of knowledge you gave at the beginning and how that has been undermined by the curriculum for excellence. But given, the first question about AI and some of the other challenges faced by the modern world, are you concerned by a kind of wider devaluation of knowledge in other countries and how that might influence Scotland's relationship on like a global stage?
Yes, yes, I am. And let me, that's a really fascinating question. Of course, there's lots of ways it could be answered. I mean, one of them, can I just use the AI hook to start answering, and then I'll answer another aspect of it as well. So a reasonable reply to my reply on the AI thing would be to say, why do we need to know this anyway? If AI can come up with a summary of the knowledge about a certain difficult proposition that is as good as a human expert could do, then why do we need human experts that have that knowledge? Well, I think that the reason we need it is the second half of my reply on the AI question, which is not the statement of from a teaching point of view, from a pedagogical point of view. The reason saying that is not enough is that the pedagogical, the educational effect is engaging with the knowledge produced by the expert, not the knowledge itself. So I still think within the confines of education, AI is a tool, it's not a substitute. We would never say, for example, that because somebody had written Dermot McCulloch has written the definitive history of the English Reformation, that nobody has to ever study the English Reformation ever again. I mean, that would be nonsense. We read Dermot McCulloch because he stimulates us into thinking of all sorts of things. However, your question is not like that, I think, so I've evaded it here, because I think you're probably saying, in the wider world, does it really matter that there are experts and non-experts, because AI can produce them all? Well, I suppose the answer to that would be, we better have people checking that the AI things are doing it well. My mother was a maths teacher, and when she was teaching towards the end of her career in the 1980s, when electronic calculators were becoming ubiquitous, everybody came into school with an electronic calculator, and people would say, why do we have to learn mental arithmetic when we can do it on our calculators? And her reply to that was, you'd better check that you've put the right data into the calculator before you can know that you've not got it wrong. And so, in other words, a new form of mental arithmetic became important. It wasn't necessarily getting exactly right what it would cost to buy 12 things at £2.33. That doesn't matter, but you would want to know that it's going to be in the 20s per sound rather than the 200s or the 2s. And so having a form of mental arithmetic that allows you to assess the quality of what you're getting out of this electronic machine is really important. And that was a standard way, sorry, I'm not making any particular claims from my mother, that was the standard approach to how maths teachers dealt with the advent of electronic calculators in the 1980s. And the same would be true of AI at a much more elevated level. I don't know how we do that, but we have to have human ways of interpreting what the AI is producing. The worrying thing, of course, is that AI becomes so powerful that it destroys us, but we can't deal with that aspect. So long as we are still in control, we'd better understand what it is that they are producing for us, because if we don't, then they will cause enormous turmoil.
Right. Well, it's been a great evening, an evening of two parts in some ways. Professor Paterson, you've given us a fascinating, in-depth and perhaps troubling overview of what's going on in Scottish education, particularly since the 60s. The other half has been the question and answer session, which I think has been fantastic. Great questions, fantastic answers. We're living in troubled times. The ability to understand what's going on in the world is critical if we're going to avoid or reduce the effects of various calamities which we seem to be heading for. An analogy, there are many reasons to have a skill like being able to shoot an arrow. Fun, hunting, conflict. But to know the history and facts about how arrows are designed, function, and affect the world is vital if we are going to be able to use them wisely. To have the ability to get near rational truth is essential. Sadly, this is something that not everyone currently seems to agree with. So hopefully, our educational system can provide us with skills and knowledge to allow us to understand the world as well as it is possible and to act on it wisely. Thank you again. And as is our norm, please accept this small memento of tonight's talk, the Society's paperweight. Thank you very much. It's been a great evening. And just to remind you that the last meeting is in the fortnight and it will be preceded by the AGM. Safe home, keep well.